Hello, and welcome to today's Praxist Table Talks. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and I have with me a member of our leadership council. Cody, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Welcome back, everyone.
So the topic for this episode will be, the inspiration comes from a video by the modern Platonist, who is, I would very much recommend checking him out. He is a sort of YouTube intellectual, internet intellectual, if you will. He talks a lot on traditionalism, paganism. He calls himself a Platonist, so you can very obviously tell what his philosophic orientation is right there, just by his name. But he calls himself an Evolian on many accounts. And so the video in question was titled Julius Evola's Spiritual Pessimism. And so that was sort of the inspiration for this topic right here, because what we're going to try to get at today is the case for spiritual optimism, which is in a sense the sort of antithesis to Evola's ideas after World War II. So I will give a link in the description to that video to check it out first. But even as a standalone podcast, this will hit, I think, some very major points that need to be said, because there's a lot of pessimism on many fronts in the modern world, both spiritually and practically. You see it almost everywhere you turn your gaze. You have antinatalist movements. You have what's the word? I guess general
disillusionment.
Complacence is what I was looking for. A general complacence for living in modernity, and a general path of passivity and just accepting things for what they are, rather than attempting to take any sort of action, any sort of positive action, both personally and as a group, or ideologically, or what have you. So basically the thesis for this episode is the case for spiritual optimism, or the case for optimism in general, not just spiritually, but you can use that as the sort of source of legitimacy and reference point for a wider sort of mental optimistic attitude towards the world and towards the future that you can very, very easily take into your own hands. And so
I would say the focus of this episode is on the spiritual aspect of things, considering that's what we dedicate most of our time and interest in intellectualizing, and then further realizing. But we'll probably get into many various ways to be optimistic and fruitful in action in real life, other than just the spiritual aspect of things in this episode. And that hits on many different coalescing points from people in our different spheres and communities, and just generally in life altogether, that I think people will find very useful, because it is difficult to navigate in many different waters.
Yeah, definitely. And there seems to be a sort of passivity to people nowadays. And this passivity, just like you had said off call, this passivity it's sort of justified by this Kali Yuga, who so many people think we are trapped within. And of course we are trapped within it, but there are ways to escape. There are methods of escasis that sort of allow us to participate in a higher reality, which is kind of the justification for spiritual optimism. And most people don't realize this, and so they sort of just use the Kali Yuga and this, the crisis of the modern world, to use another term of Guénon's, to sort of justify this passive, attitude towards the world, and just, live in complacency and not like I said, not take any sort of positive action, either communally, spiritually, or even individually within their own lives. And so again, this episode's thesis is, the case for spiritual optimism. What is the fundamental point of reference for spiritual optimism, and what is its justification, and why should it be adopted? And so to kind of get us started, the topic of the modern Platonist video was Evola's spiritual pessimism. And so Evola's spiritual pessimism is about, quote, the inability for modern man to access true spiritual tradition, or pure authentic tradition. And so what this essentially means is that, Evola knew that we were living in the Kali Yuga. Almost all of recorded history is supposed to be within the Kali Yuga. But, you see this, it's sort of broken up into these essential categories in 4-3-2-1 ratio in durations, which is kind of what I'm going to get at with our next recording, with the Revolt Against the Modern World series, which this is kind of an intermission of, which is why I've chosen the topic at hand. But you've got the Kali Yuga broken up into these 4, 3, 2, 1 ratios, and the longer duration in the beginning is that duration of the 4, and then you got the duration of the 3 and the duration of the 2 and the duration of the 1, and this sort of snowballing effect as time goes on is felt until you get to the culmination of all of these, or the convergence of all of these trajectories, the culmination of all of these elements that are snowballed onto this dark age that we live in, into a certain point that we have in modernity that now has detached all continuities from our world to the quintessential reality, which is kind of what pure authentic tradition is. And so Evola talks about, pure authentic tradition as being the sort of participation in the quintessential reality. And what that means is, you have the idea of metaphysics, you have the idea of a design before the actual manifestation of the design, and then you have the adherence of the manifestation to the design. And insofar as the manifestation is adhered to the design, you have a certain continuity, and that allows the design to participate in the same quality of being that the design that allows the manifestation to participate in the same quality of being as the design participates in. And so this idea transposed onto the humanly principle is what we can consider to be tradition. It is the humanly way of participating into the quintessential reality, or a humanly participation in the quintessential reality. And so any tradition that actualizes the certain continuities or the certain passive potentials within humanity to align with this reality is considered to be an authentic tradition, or a true spiritual tradition in the Evolian sense. And so this is what Evola concerned himself with. And so his thesis was, or his general attitude towards this was, that in the modern world there is pretty much no way for anyone to access true spiritual tradition. And because of this, you had to sort of ride the tiger, as it were, to quote one of his titles as well. You have to sort of ride the tiger until, you die. You sort of have to just live in the situation of the Kali Yuga and not do too much. He sort of condemned action, as it were, in his later period of life. And if you contrast this attitude with Evola of the 20s, in his, in the earlier periods of his life, you see a stark difference in attitude. In his earlier life, Evola was much more supportive of the path of action, and he even tried to, justify the forces of fascism using his group, which I will get to in a little bit, and using his own Roman pagan revivalism, to try to essentially capitalize on this action that was being taken within the 20s in this very tumultuous time period. And if you contrast that with the modern day, you can see that the activity of the 1920s, especially in Italy and in Europe, that was the result of so many factors of World War I and the economic crisis and whatnot. You can see similar crises today, 100 years later, but there is no similar activity. And the reason for this is because of this spiritual depression that's not the fault of Evola's, but is sort of widespread now into wider groups of society, be it docility or complacence, or just a general apathy towards the modern world or towards participating within life. And so essentially spiritual optimism would be to revive that idea that Evola held in the 20s, that action is good and that we need to take positive corresponding action to the problems that we see, both spiritually and socially and politically. It all derives from that spiritual optimism. So Evola knew that we were living in the Kali Yuga, but he also knew about the race of the heroes. He also knew about the idea in Greek mythology of the heroes, which are this proposed race that is essentially going to halt the decline, or halt the decay of society as the Kali Yuga progresses. The race of heroes was essentially supposed to reverse that decline, or halt it in its tracks, and produce the capability to participate in the same type of spirituality that one could participate in the Golden Age. And so, of course, once again, this golden age spirituality equals participation in the quintessential reality. And so, in a sense, so the heroes are supposed to bring back the golden age, or is supposed to allow a certain transposition of true, authentic tradition into the modern world. And so that's what he thought could have resulted from the idea of, like, you know, the various conservative revolutionary movements that were happening at the time. You saw it with Mussolini. You saw it in Germany, not with Hitler, but with the actual conservative revolutionaries in Germany. And you see him write things, trying to be opportunistic on these various occasions to try to transform society back into something that could have a true, authentic tradition living within it. And so he did not obviously reject the course of action, or he did not reject the path of action in his early life, and later on in his life he did. So, do you have anything to say before we kind of go into the various forces and you know, trajectories and whatnot?
Yeah, well, I guess it all kind of leads into that because it's a general rejection of Evelyn's pessimism. I don't know if you want me to just hold off on that and we can get into more in depth on his initial optimism, even though you kind of covered it leading into his pessimism, or if you want me to just go straight for what's on my mind.
Yeah, sure. Just go straight for what's on your mind.
So, I think that the problem with Evelyn's thinking isn't so much that he is wrong in entirety. I think it's just that he didn't have the perspective to be able to capitalize on different means of that great man coming about and redefining what a great man is. To put it in terms of Carlyle, because I'm thinking of him at the moment, a hero or the heroic person in Evelyn's terms, to redirect the course of civilization back into the traditional, back into the golden age, and have this resurgence. I think that Evelyn, seeing the prospects of, you know, the third positionists in World War II, was hopeful for ultimately what they were moving towards, but disillusioned, one, in their defeat, and two, on his further analysis of their ideologies, considering their more material and what is the word?
Plebeian character is what he...
Temporal.
Yeah,
temporal nature. But yes, that too. I guess it was too big of a black pill for Evelyn, to put it in our contemporary terms, to really then recover from. And we're here to dish out some white pills, just so everyone's clear. And part of that is recognizing that we have different perspectives on the matter now, not just that our opinions differ, but we actually have a way of viewing the world that was probably inaccessible to Evelyn because of the change in time, or the changes over the course of time, rather, that have occurred on a technological, civilizational, philosophical, in pretty much every single metrical scale you could think of in these terms. And so the image that Evelyn was thinking of is this sort of Herculean type of heroic figure of the traditional age of old, that I guess he kind of got in his own way from, even though he warned other people not to do the same, in the fact that he said the age of tradition is in the past merely by circumstance. That's not necessarily how it is going to look in the future when we go back into tradition, if we ever do. And I think we're going to make the case here very steadily that we will. It is an eventuality, not just a question of if. It's a matter of when. And Evelyn being disillusioned to that fact, I think, was just that he won't see it in his lifetime, and he feared he may not see it may not come to fruition at all, because he didn't see any path into the future as modernity shifted into post-modernity and things became more deconstructed, more disillusioned and individualized,
detached and atomized as well.
Exactly. And that caused a whole ripple effect for things to erode even more deeply and even more quickly, which I might argue is a good thing. And I'm not trying to be an accelerationist here, but things must always get worse before they get better. And one might ask, well, how much worse does it have to get before it gets better? All the way. And that sounds scary, but it's not. Because that makes, the forces of evil and the seeming overwhelming power of this monstrous statehood and antinatalist and anti-spiritual and anti-everything human paradigm that we're in will also get weaker in that aspect. And so this radical atomization of the human existence will affect all aspects in that respect. And then people like us will be able to collectivize ourselves, organize ourselves, and regain power, not just in a practical Machiavellian sense, but in a spiritual and fulfilled sense. And even still, that may not be within our own lifetimes. And that's, two guys in our 20s and probably many more people in the audience now and other people in these air quote dissident or sensible centrist spheres is a very long time. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us to actualize this goal, but that doesn't mean that it's still not inevitable. We just have to make sure that we get off our asses, to put it bluntly and crudely, to put in that work. And, plenty of people are. So many people are. And I want to give credit where credit's due, but many people are still caught up in this paradigm and do have this defeatist mentality, even when there's so many bounds and strides that have been made, and will kind of relish that bit of comfort they've gained now because they're used to this sort of abuse that we've experienced on mental and spiritual levels pretty much all our lives. I know for Vincent and myself, all our lives, even unconsciously. But that gets into a sense of complacency, and it kind of rides off the coattails of where Evola left in his own spiritual journey, his own intellectual journey, in concluding that there is no hope for this heroic age to come. Getting back to that mode of perspective, these heroes might manifest in different ways. They might not be the Caesarian figure we're all hoping for, and how many people had been hoping for that and putting too much emphasis on individuals like Trump, or maybe Bolsonaro, or so on and so forth, because they are still products of post-modernity even, and they are held very firmly within our time and the narratives that kind of encompass it now. So putting our faith in figures like that, who have been, in the past, even though they're still, living amongst us, they're of the past in this postmodern mindset. And we have to look more into the youth and the future, or our contemporaries right now amongst us. The, some of the Gen Xers, like the academic agents or distributists or so on, some of the younger millennials, some of the Zoomers especially, that have been really making strides in things, Prudentialist or Ryan Turnipseed, ourselves, and moving in ways that wouldn't be this rallying of the gantry, rallying of the peasants or whatever with pitchforks and everything else to, throw everything over in this revolution like leftists have this romanticization of. It's more of a learning of what our battleground is now and doing heroic feats in the arenas we have set up in front of us. And that isn't really a traditional battlefield like we would think of in the traditional mindset that Evola probably envisioned. And, I am speaking on his behalf because we don't really know exactly what was in his mind, even though he painted a very vivid picture with all the writings that he published.
Yeah,
he still shows that. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, he seemed very much to change his attitude over the course of time, and so trying to approximate what exactly he felt at a given time is, I don't think it encompasses the totality of his opinion on the matter. It just, it depends on what time you look at, and it depends on the circumstances in which he was going through. It's very very relative to the times were his opinions, I would say.
Yes, and that's over the course of his entire life, where he might be well entrenched into one idea of things, and then move away from that and go into another. And that same process goes on with people like us, especially Zoomers, but far more rapidly. And we could change our minds and attitudes by the week or even the day. And I know I'm like that sometimes as well, where I'll jump between two very different extremes to find a solution for the same issue. And it's frustrating because those both, or maybe like multifaceted type of paradigm, seems very attractive, and both have their, ideally being brought into reality would be genuine solutions to the problem, but that would mean full dedication to one and not the other. And if that one does fail, then you can't really go back and restart. And so it's this sort of very clustered scenario where you have all these options available open to you, but you don't know which one to take. And one necessarily would discount all the others. And so now it's everyone in these spheres of ours trying to figure out which direction we all need to go in that collectively, because if we have different branching groups all sort of pushing in opposite directions, we're just going to cancel each other out and ruin it for others in the event that we do have a solution that could be working, but some other fringe sphere will do something extreme and then put the cathedral on high guard and kind of squash any progress we might make. Accelerationists being one of those, and causing collateral damage to people and their lives, innocence, really, and just making things worse from a optics level and a practical level and a spiritual level in many facets, because that will just demoralize people more. And where I was getting back to is that these arenas that we're fighting in have champions already set forth for us to defeat, our enemies on these battlefields. They just aren't grown up enough yet, or are almost there. We just need a little more time to brew to see the fruits of everyone's labor.
Yeah.
Because the system as we see it is at its strongest, but that means it's all going downhill from here, and it's going to collapse rapidly. I mean, everything is already kind of collapsing around us, but that's for the average person, not necessarily the strangleholds of power. But that wave kind of crests into the other, and then both will sort of sink the ship entirely. But from that, the survivors will float ashore and find paradise. And I think that's what we necessarily need to focus on, because it seems all doom and gloom, and it reminds me of one of the quotes from Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse. I tell you not for your comfort, yea, not your desire, save the sky grows darker yet and the sea rises higher. And that's not a call of to diminish our efforts, but to go, you have a very dark battle ahead of you. You must press on and push through it, despite how ominous and foreboding it seems, because on the other side, paradise will await. And I think I can save the rest there, because otherwise my thoughts are going to get a little too spacey.
No problem.
Let's refocus.
You're making very, very good points. It kind of goes back to what Rene Guénon was saying in Crisis of the Modern World. He just in the preface, he talks about a crisis being a sort of critical point, and this is something that we've ourselves sort of identified. The critical point of a society is not necessarily the end of a society, but it is the point at which there is a convergence of the various trajectories that define the preceding time, if that makes sense. And so in Crisis of the Modern World, his thesis is essentially that the modern world is coming to the point of a crisis. Not that the modern world itself is a crisis, but that it is coming to a culmination of sorts. Like I said, that sort of snowball effect. And he says that, let me see here. He says, In other words, he says, it may be said then, in order to reduce the question to its true proportions, that we really do seem to be approaching the end of a world, or, in other words, the end of an epoch or historical cycle, which may also correspond to the end of a cosmic cycle, in accordance with the teaching of all traditional doctrines on the subject. So, with the Kali Yuga and so on. But he says later on, in the last paragraph of his preface right there, he says, let it be said at once, however, that this is no reason to submit passively to the disorder and obscurity that seem to be triumphing at the moment. For were it so, we should have nothing better to do than remain silent. On the contrary, it is a reason for striving to the utmost to prepare for the way out of this dark age, for there are many signs that its end is already relatively near, if not imminent. This is also part of the appointed order of things, for equilibrium is the result of a simultaneous action of two contrary tendencies. If one or the other could cease to act entirely, equilibrium would never be restored, and the world itself would disappear. But this supposition has no possibility of realization, for the two terms of an opposition have no meaning apart from each other, and whatever the appearances may be, one may be sure that all partial and transitory disequilibriums contribute in the end towards realizing the total equilibrium. So, it goes off into the weeds a little bit with the last part of that, but basically he's saying, that there should be no submission to the order of things, no passivity, no complacency to the order of things in which we are living right now. Now, in his early life, Evola would have said the same thing. Evola would have said, there should be no submission to the general climate that we live in today, the order of ideas that we live in today. There should be no submission to that. There should instead be action towards ending it almost as quickly as possible, and from the ashes, rebuild a certain type of civilization on the principles of a golden age type of spirituality. And so just to give an idea of what we mean when we say, when we use some of these terms, the golden age, it references, the first age of that 4-age cycle. In various traditional doctrines, you have the doctrine of the 4 ages. You have, the Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga. Or in Greek mythology, those translate into the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And all of these ages correspond to different levels of propriety in the traditions that define that civilization. And the level of material attunement of humanity to the various spheres that they evolve into. And so, basically, the Golden Age corresponds to a time in which there is a true type of spirituality, no deviation, no departure, through and through, the type of spirituality is proper. And the Silver Age, or the Second Age, the Treta Yuga, corresponds to a time when a certain materialization takes form, a certain attunement to the physical domain, and the shifting of reference points from the absolute transcendent principle to various relativities occur. And so this is when you start to see this decline in the quality of the civilization, the quality of the tradition, or the propriety of the tradition. And that's not to say that the Silver Age is in any way bad. It is just qualitatively worse than the Golden Ages. And so this same process takes, effect into a Third Age, or the Bronze Age, which is essentially when tradition is at its lowest point, where there is still a sort of fundamental vision of what is true and holistic and proper. There is still a visage of that fundamental principle from which it is proper for all traditions to derive, but it becomes very obscured in all of the emphasizations of different principles that are antithetical to that idea. And then the Kali Yuga the Iron Age, is in a sense the last age. This is the age in which there is complete material attunement, and in which the access to spirituality is very limited, because there is almost a complete loss of sight of that which is, truly holistic and fundamental, that fundamental quintessential reference point. That is what we call the quintessential truth. And so all of these correspond as such into a cycle where, the Golden Age leads to a Silver Age, leads to a Bronze Age, leads to an Iron Age. And at times, the Iron Age will have within it a certain group of people, which in Greek mythology is characterized as the race of heroes, which will allow which they themselves participate in the type of golden age spirituality, the true type of, transcendental spirituality. And these people are essentially either said to halt the decline, like I said before, or to restart the cycle, in a sense, push back the cycle, or not reverse, but begin a new cycle at the lowest point and sort of rise up to a new golden age. That's what the race of heroes is sort of destined to do, mythologically or typologically. And so, like I said, when we reference golden age spirituality, we reference that type of participation in the quintessential reality. And this type of participation is, like I said, holistic and true. It is authentic. There is no departure from this type of reality from the standpoint of the individual. So, where this comes into play in modernity is that you have this idea of not being able to access that reality through any type of ritual, because as Evola states in both Revolting Against the Modern World and The Fall of Spirituality, which are two books that kind of go together, if you look at any type of deviation from the traditional religious path of which would be Catholicism in the West, and even if you look at Catholicism itself in the West, all of it's gone on a path of decline. So Evola looks at the various New Age spiritual movements. He looks at the Theosophists. He looks at, just offhand, the primitivist movements. He looks at neo-spirituality. He looks at Rudolf Steiner and a few various other authors and movements at the time. And he identifies within them certain traits, certain characteristics that are missing for the quintessential reality to be truly accessible. And all of this he attributes to the fault of the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age in which we live. He says that through these traditions, you can no longer access this mode of being. And same thing with Catholicism. He says that through Catholicism, you can still no longer access this mode of being because the institution itself is corrupt. And so because this institution is corrupt and because these other ideas are coming about with corrupt reference points just in general, there is no access to this mode of being unless you were to sort of protect, identify, and espouse the true sacred perennial path. And so this also gets into capital T tradition and whatnot. But all of this leads up to Evola founding the Ur group. That is Ur. Ur comes from the Germanic prefix meaning something quote-unquote primal or ancestral. And when we go into it, it's funny because this Ur group very much reflects Evola's positivity at the time of the 20s when he founded it. And the Ur group is very much like what we're doing with Praxia. It was a, quote, Italian esotericist association, and it was founded in 1927 by the intellectuals including Julius Evola, Arturo Regini, and Giovanni Colazza for the study of traditionalism and magic. And so it also goes on to say that it is for the revitalization of the perennial tradition and what Evola called the sacred mysteries. And all of this sounds very similar to what we're doing with Praxia right now. He founded this to sort of identify this knowledge and then safeguard it and then propound it through a magazine, which he called a magazine of the same name. It was called Ur, which is very similar to the writings that we are doing now. And so this path of action that he's involved himself in is one that he pulls back from later. And so the Ur group, it ultimately fails. I don't know exactly when it dissipated, but eventually it did. Let's see, maybe it was 1929. Anyways, go ahead.
It also sounds very similar to like what you just mentioned with the Theosophists and Madame Blavatsky, and how she was a bit of a precursor to Evola in this regard as well. But everything was a bit more spurious and unconnected, and then Evola sort of refined it, and then we're now just starting to gather and then refine his works even further. And even though he kind of recanted this call to action later on in life, that initial action that he put forth would ripple down and skip a generation or two, or 3 or 4 rather. But but then work its way to us and to revitalize this and keep it moving forward to the point where we do have this heroic age become more pronounced. And because of the time Evola lived, and that was just a short few decades ago, it was this time of great materialization and globalization and atomization that has now come to its head, like I said, where everything's at its height, or at least so we think. There's only so much more you could go further down before hitting the bottom.
Yeah.
And then from that, it will bounce up like fairly quickly, and we will get this revitalization through these arenas, like I was mentioning, and like how you were just demonstrating here with these different groups that are coming about and sort of reiterating the history and traditions that are sort of manifested. And this is where I think Evola didn't have the perspective available to him to understand how this heroic age will jump forth in ways that he probably wouldn't expect, because there is always the precursor, the primordial, the in this effect to create the tradition that everyone will then be initiated into. And there's always the first. And traditions die and then get revitalized and reborn into new things that may be completely disassociated from where their origins may genuinely lie, because there's a historical disconnect there, much like what the circle that's trying to be squared, or the square that's trying to be circled, with the neo-pagans and their disconnect from their perceived spiritual ancestry because of the hundreds of years of Christianity that had overtaken it. And
that
this
reminds
now
me of
is
a writing that I wanted to do. I'm sorry for interrupting, but that reminds me of a writing, an article that I wanted to make on, let's see, I call it existentialist paganism, because in a sense the modern neo-pagans in a sense have this sort of they fall under the same trap that Evola identifies within these other spiritualist groups as well. You know, you have the basically to define all authentic tradition, it has to go back to this one quintessential truth, right? Which means that there has to be a singular monistic principle. Whereas in the paganistic tendencies that you see today, it's very existentialist in saying that existentialism means that we are living in this sort of disconnected world where there is no monistic or unifying principle. And that's the problem, I think, is that modern paganism is focused, on the relative aspect. Sorry, go ahead.
The consequences of the demiurge, as they would say. And no, that was an excellent interruption there, because that kind of gets to the point of the neo-pagan point I was making, where they have this existential outlook on things that also isn't actualized, because it's this postmodern or aspect of modernity, this vying for the traditional through subgroups and outlets that is purely aesthetic and vain in its entirety, and doesn't actually get to the root of the traditional way of life, because what they are going for is a mode of tradition in the capital T sense that already had its time and place in history, and they're trying to revive it, which is ultimately futile, as Evola writes, and as what Modern Platonist was saying too in his video, and reinforcing what Evola's assessment was on this revitalization or renaissance of spirituality in the capital T tradition, because it is always trying to look into the past to recreate this hyper-specific monad and or plurality of a pantheon that can if we just did things this way again, everything would be all right. And that's the exact opposite of what we need to do. We need to look forward at how to recreate the traditions in our modern world to penetrate into modernity and germinate into society, so that people can be reinitiated into their proper modes of being. And collectivized, and this sounds very utilitarian and very managerial in a sense, but it's just the vocabulary I'm unfortunate enough to have been uh, born into utilizing. So I hope everyone understands what I'm trying to get at, in that there is a way of going about this that can work, but you can't get hung up on
the
the
formalities
hyper-specifics
of it. Yeah.
or the formalities, like how we mentioned in previous episodes on similar topics with, what was that?
The dogmatic episode.
Hyper-specific. The dogma episode. That's exactly what we have to avoid in these situations. And things not working out in the immediate, maybe because we're getting hung up on the details instead of looking things at the broader picture. And part of that is separating these civilizational battles here, which, Evola was prescient on pointing out in something like Ride the Tiger, which is a very good way of demonstrating this point on this struggle between man and modernity. However, in order for this heroic age to come about, it's not so much a tiger that we are all riding collectively. It's more of a wrestling with a python. Like, what was it? What's his name? Sir Leighton, yes. The series of statues by Sir Leighton, an athlete wrestling with a python. Very, very impactful piece of art that has made its round online in many dissident and I believe even pagan spheres, because of the imagery it invokes of this, strong, masculine, chiseled physique wrestling against a apex predator that, for a lesser man, would be consumed by it. And this is the individual battle we all face within modernity over the own struggles of our life. And it is a constricting, suffocating feeling, like a python being wrapped around us and crushing us to death. And that is the clutches of modernity. However, if you actualize yourself and train yourself and make yourself stronger, you can fight it, unwrap it, and cast it aside. You don't necessarily have to kill it, which is a thing that people will jump to immediately into the ultra-violent sphere of things, because it is, at the end of the day, a natural culmination of events that isn't a conscious enemy or threat in a sense, because the things that happen to you in your daily life and the struggles that you have to overcome are kind of just processes of this internal heroic actualization. And that's all things that we can work on, and which will give us greater purpose and satisfaction in slowly defeating and unwrapping this constriction that's crushing us. And the more we'll be able to breathe, the easier it will be to eventually win over these things. And then collectively, it would move to something like Hercules and the Nemean lion, where, no individual person like ourselves is going to take on the behemoth of the state apparatuses, the cathedral, the whatever you may call it, Babylon and the WEF, or who knows what Illuminati type of boogeymen that we all like to point to as these ominous, overarching type of villains that are coming down with the full force of soft and hard power on us and closing in ever further. But like what Evelyn was trying to get at in this optimism, and what is the eventuality that we're trying to get at too, there will be a Hercules that comes about to defeat the Nemean lion. And the point I was trying to make is that any individuals like ourselves aren't going to be able to take on the system 1v1. Like, that is our Nemean lion. We have no effect on it on an individual level, because it just is this impenetrable thing. But together, we can sort of take a step back, find the right person, as is the, what was it, the boy from Cretan? I forget what the town was in the Trial of Hercules, but that boy then finds Hercules to defeat the lion, and that is our hero that we, raise amongst our own ranks, not some dark horse figure that is already well entrenched in the establishment and well entrenched in this past of modernity, like the Elon Musks or the Trumps or the whomevers that are parts of these neoliberal globalist type of systems, and instead just cultivate our own lives by unwrapping those pythons from us and making a stronger community so we can keep that Nemean lion at bay. We can keep it satisfied so it doesn't attack us until we have the right person to have them go one-on-one with each other. And Hercules wins in the end. That's his first trial that he overcomes, and each one after that was even more harrowing than the last. So the lion is a lesser threat than we realize because it is lower on the priority board than these other, spiritual consequences, as is like the destiny of our souls after we die, depending on the actions we've taken in our own life and so on and so forth. And those are real consequences that we may have to consider, which, seem distant or even just fictitious to many people because of the more prescient material threats that we face in our own lives. But those are more or less catastrophizations of the times we live in. I find the times that we live in incredibly optimistic and engaging and exciting because we live in an era now where we are given the opportunity to overcome great evils and overcome, which we already have in many respects, the most pernicious and effective and streamlined methods of demoralization, of propaganda, of security state apparatuses monitoring and controlling every aspect of our lives. And no regime in history up until this point had that kind of power until today, with all these technologies and all of these methods of psychologizing things that is now accessible to the elites or Babylon Cathedral, whatever have you, utilizing it on the population now. But the fact that we exist at all, the fact that there's so many tens of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people like us in these spheres having these conversations that are, awake to these lies, that are conscious of these deceitful notions and propagandas that have been inundating our minds since we were born, since before we were born, because it affected our parents even while, we were gestating in our mother's wombs, which had a physical, tangible effect on us even then. We still were able to overcome it and be at this position now where we can have these conversations to, eventually defeat it altogether. And that is an achievement in and of itself, because in all reality, we shouldn't exist by the vast power of these mind control apparatuses to have us all be unthinking NPCs that go along with the narrative. But somehow, some way, we were resistant to that, either through great effort and will or through some predisposition that we possessed that may be that eminence, that daemon that is within us, as we read in the Revolt Against the Modern World chapters. That is that heroic spirit to come about and be our saving grace down the line, if not within our immediate spheres now with the people we have alive today, us setting up the stage for the people that will come after us, planting the seeds, for trees whose shade we will never know. And then we will have those heroes rest under those trees after, a long and arduous battle that finally puts these systems to rest.
There's a lot to unpack there. You went on for quite some time. There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, sorry, but I think that was the big white pill for everyone to take.
Absolutely, no, 100%. There's a couple things that you mentioned that I wanted to touch upon, because you make some good points. So when you talked about the idea of, with the dogma episode, touching upon the idea of loyalty to form and all of that with the pagans, kind of where the point first started. There's this certain idea, certainly among primitivists, which is one of the groups that Evola condemned. There's a certain loyalty to form in the sense that you have to do everything by way of being a-technological or anti-technological. There's a certain idea that technology equates to, I don't want to say anti-tradition because I wouldn't call these people traditional themselves, but technology equates
the return to monkey types.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That technology, in a sense, equates to impropriety of sorts. I wouldn't even say it's just the return to monkey type. I would say that it's also prevalent in the sort of neo-pagans that want to embrace a sort of spiritist attitude and live like a medieval lord or a medieval peasant or what have you, or a Viking or what have you. Whatever aesthetic they like to tack onto it. They like to live like the group whose gods you worship, when that is all a loyalty to form. But the relevance of that to this episode, I think, is that their pessimism often derives from the irreversibility of the technological progress that we've made, in society thus far. And I use progress in a positive term because I don't think technology, I'm very, I would say I hold this controversial opinion in traditionalist spheres that technology isn't necessarily the bad thing. Technology is a tool, and anything that's of the temporal domain itself is a tool, whether it be power or technology or any type of faculty whatsoever is really it is a tool. And technology just means that it's the tool of scale. You could punch someone and you could kill them in the same amount of time that you could swipe a sword and kill 10 people, in the same amount of time that you could shoot a gun and kill 100 people. It's the tool of scale. The more you've progressed technologically, you have a wider scope of effect, in a sense. The more technology you apply. And
I guess the more refined the technology is.
Yeah, the more refined it is, or the more developed it is. And so there's this sort of pessimism that comes along with this loyalty to form, where these people think so much that they would like to, participate in not in the mode of being as their ancestors did, but in the way of being, or in the method through which this mode is approached. Be it through building with regular, building through medieval means, whether it be like making your house in a medieval style, whether it be, painting with medieval paints, or, it doesn't have to be just medieval. I'm using that as an example, but, people who are attached to the times and attached to the lifestyle associated with their favorite historical period, which their religion just happened, or their spiritual path just happens to come from. And because of this progress,
it's a pageantry that misses the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
More or less.
And so this progress, of course, disillusions them from this lifestyle that they wish they could live, that they idealize, more or less. And so because they live in a highly technologized world, this adds to this disillusionment, this detachment from reality, because they know that they'll never be able to live in a society like the one that they want to live in. You know what I mean? Whereas, it is totally possible to live in a traditional society that is technologically developed, in the same way that it is totally possible to live in an anti-traditional society that is, primitivist. You know what I mean? In primitive in technology.
And that pessimism, neo-pagan and otherwise, of this sort of Luddite mentality against technology, then gets us very hardcore reactionaries like Ted Kaczynski. He was very much aware of all of these effects, and was one of those people that was could be argued as a heroic figure, not saying that he's someone who should be idealized, but in the purest senses of the words, from the Evolian perspective, to revolt against the modern world in the way he saw fit in this war against technology and of corporate progress in that sense. But
he equated one with the other too.
Yeah, exactly. And what we've mentioned many times before is that Kaczynski also missed the forest for the trees, ironically enough, considering who he was, because he misidentified those tools, like you were saying technology is, for who was utilizing them. And any tool can be misused, and it can only be used as effectively as the person who wields it. And so he very easily could have gone down a different path that utilized the same technologies and amassed them in a counterweight to how they were being misused in the destruction of the environment and all the things that he was witnessing that made him and drove him to do what he did.
Like how Guénon defined that type of action that raises the equilibrium or reestablishes the equilibrium.
Exactly. And so he went down this destructive path because he was disillusioned and pessimistic. And neo-pagans going down the same road, or whomever in the same road will get extremely pessimistic, and you'll get sort of almost, like I said, these accelerationists who want to just burn the system down and take any material action they can to effectively, throw rocks at a tank, more or less.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the wrong way of going about it.
Exactly. And then, of course, they see that throwing rocks at a tank will not work. And then they become very disillusioned and become depressed and say that, modernity is doomed to, or we are all doomed to modernity, when in reality, we are just doomed to a world in which the tools for us to exist. I feel like this mindset comes from a very naive place. We live in a time where the quality of life has, on average, never been higher, at least in our country, at least in the developed world. And I think that that's something that we could very much be thankful for. If anything, we can say, the wielders of the technology are, nefarious at best, and they are, and the conditions that we live in financially might not be the best, with the disparity being way more between disparity between low class and high class being more than it was during the French Revolution. But we have centralized heating, we have AC, we have these methods through which we can communicate with each other over these vast distances and organize groups, and we have the internet as a sort of if you use it properly as a tool of research, to find all of this knowledge and
tool of community organizing even.
Exactly. And you can sort of immerse yourself in these various communities and immerse yourself into this an academic pursuit that might not have been available to you because of a lack of hard copy translations of books that you might want to read that might not even exist, in your language or something like that. So we've come very far technologically, and I don't think that is to be seen as a negative. It is just to be seen as a risk. It's a high risk because the more you develop technologically, the higher the risk is that if someone, who were to use this to nefarious ends were to come into possession of this technology, it would obviously have a much broader and wider and dire impact than it would if the technology was on a developed way less. But yeah, I feel like. Oh, go ahead.
No, you finish your thought.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I feel like this technology adds to this pessimism of the neo-pagans themselves, the ones who are loyal to this the sort of formalities that surround the era of their favored historical society. And I'm poking at the Norse ones because those are the ones that this is most prominent about. But it comes in all shapes and sizes, whether it be like Wiccans or heathens or whatever. Not to say that these traditions themselves don't try to touch upon something spiritual. It's just that they don't. It's the difference between mysticism and true spirituality, which I will get to in a second after you say your point.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the tank example because there are 3 outcomes in that scenario too when people become combative to the system in these lone wolf sort of outburst sense, and they either realize that they can't harm the tank and they become nihilists, or they attack the tank and get demolished by it, or they find something that they can hurt and then take out their frustrations on that. And we can point to a myriad of examples of all 3 that happen constantly, that are just so frustratingly abundant in our modern age, because this happens all the time, because that just is the struggle for everyone. But that's everyone being atomized, focusing on that Nemean lion, instead of, the python that's constricting them. And that's why they can't have, this rock that they're throwing at the tank be effective. They need to call in, some air support, and that's that hero that comes in much later when they can actually organize around the threat and look at it more totally,
holistically. Yeah, definitely. And so another part of this is also due to the divide between mysticism and true spirituality, which is another thing I think causes the sort of negative outlook, or the sort of seeping of negativity into the mindsets of people who practice this. Because people will seek out spiritual traditions or spiritual paths to try to align with them, to try to satiate the human faculty that is yearning to participate in the quintessential reality, which is namely the spirit, and the spirit in the true and holistic sense. And so people obviously seek out things like modern spirituality, all of these which Evola himself, let me get the book out here, all of these which Evola himself has condemned, from let's see here, from spiritualism and psychic research, psychoanalysis, theosophism, anthroposophy, neo-mysticism, integral traditionalism, primitivism, Satanism, high magic. All of these things Evola critiques as being sort of these neo-spiritualist perversions of actual spirituality. And so mysticism would essentially be defined as such. It would be the presence of the emotional or the the emotional or the sentimental element. It is this sort of sensory delusion that one is accessing something higher. But, one accesses this through, whether it be through drugs or through some sort of sensory element, some sort of alteration physically, where it needs to be a mental alteration first before it is a physical one, if the physical one is even necessary at that point. Whereas spirituality, true spirituality, means something intellectual, right? Something an intuition that is innate to the intellect, that allows for a knowledge of and a participation in this higher reality, or this higher mode of being. And so you mentioned the heroes of our age are not going to be these deeply entrenched individuals who, like your Musks or your Trumps or your whatever political figure may come out against the establishment, but is still very much, like you said, entrenched in the worldview of modernity, which is this secularistic, materialistic, hedonistic focus on technocracy and financial gain. Which isn't to say that that financial gain is necessarily bad, but again, it is another tool. But these deeply entrenched individuals in things that are not that are rooted in modernity. So this was another idea that I wanted to get into. I actually got into this on I'm going to plug the Substack now, because I actually got into this on our mission statement on our Substack. So go check that out. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted you to finish that.
I was going to say it's praxia.substack.com, and it's the first post on there is the mission statement. But I get into this in the mission statement. I was going to get into it, but I know you wanted to say something, so go ahead.
I think I know a good way of demonstrating this point in a familiar way for everybody too. It's these heroes coming about are going to be more like foxes than they are going to be like lions, and I think that is what that perspective, that Evolian misinterpretation of the heroic age coming about would look like, because the systems that be now have been run by foxes for such a long time, and they know how to defeat lions whenever they pop up, or how to at least tame them and utilize them for their own means and methods. And then you have the hundreds of thousands of sheep that sort of follow the lion's command at the fox's behest, because the foxes can consistently outwit the lions. But you will have a far more pernicious fox in our circle of things. That would be the alpha fox, in a sense. Almost closer to a lion, but still very much a fox, that can outwit and outmaneuver the foxes that control our systems and our societies without, targeting them at their strongest points, because a lion would rather do that. And this is the the personality types in leadership. I forget who from, but it's often talked about in spheres like academic agent and so forth, that delineate these two types of leaders. And so we'll have these foxes in our own spheres that, will embrace the tenets of the lion, more so once they've outmaneuvered the old foxes that are already sort of resting in their dens of power. And that's how this battle is going to play out. These are the heroic figures that isn't the image that we're expecting, because we're all expecting a lion when you hear something like hero or heroic, but it very much is playing the game better than the people in charge at the moment. And that's not necessarily playing by their rules or playing in the systems themselves. Again, it's outmaneuvering and outsmarting them, because they've become complacent as well, and they are just as entrenched in these systems as everyone else. And that's why they're very easy at recognizing lions like the Elons and the Trumps and outmaneuvering them, outpacing them, or using whatever power they had to combat any moves they make and effectively push them out of power once again. And that's where that's what we can't do and get caught up on. And I think that's probably the best way we can envision how this is all going to play out.
Yeah. And, I think it's taking that one step further. It's not just about the fox and the lion, or a differentiation or dichotomy between the two. I think that the race of the heroes corresponds to beings that both manifest the traits of the fox and of the lion. And I think that corresponds to the philosopher king as well. The philosopher king is a king who knows how to maneuver and play politics, but also knows how to put his hand down and be very firm when he needs to be. And
yes, of course.
Both traits, I think, are necessary in maneuvering our way out of the Kali Yuga, as it were. But so this idea corresponds to well, first, what I wanted to say is I outlined this idea in our mission statement, and it sort of begins with outlining the law for analogical correspondences, which essentially means that you can take the quantitative or the qualitative value of something greater and attribute it to something lesser that is within the domain of the greater thing. So, if you had this is kind of like how Evola was talking about time, and if you watched our Revolt Against the Modern World, the last podcast we did, how Evola was talking about time, how the lesser units equal numerations of greater units if combined together, where it's sort of this infinite regress of higher and higher. The law of analogical correspondences means just that. So if you have the quality of a certain type of quality on one sphere, that quality is usually transposed by something that is higher than it, something that is more abstract and universal. So if you take the law of analogical correspondences and you apply it to the quality of a civilization or the time period in which a civilization is currently in, whether it be given human civilization or the totality of human civilization, in its entirety, you can kind of see that one is kind of dictated by the other, right? The totality of human civilization is more or less, it more or less dictates the quality of the specific civilizations or specific societies that exist within it. And so you can look at if all of humanity is within the Kali Yuga, then every society, every human civilization will be in different stages of the Kali Yuga itself until all of them have kind of like crumbled to the ground or whatever, lost all sight of that which is most fundamental, and all require a rebirth. And that is this sort of grand cycle. And every civilization will go through a mini cycle that represents the grand cycle. And, this will happen time and time again within a given age, just because of the law of analogical correspondences. And so this idea also corresponds to institutions. You have the institutions themselves of a given society manifest the qualities that are associated with the society in which the institution exists. So let's take, for example, the church, right? Or a government or something like that. A church in the Golden Age would most definitely, reflect the characteristics of Golden Age spirituality, and it would allow for a participation in the quintessential reality. It would have all of the proper qualities attributed onto it because it exists within that time period. But because institutions exist in the Kali Yuga, they have all of the properties of the Kali Yuga grafted onto them first, which supersede any connection they had to something that is beyond it. And so the reason I preface it with this is because there is a possibility for something, as long as it has a given sight of that which is most fundamental, that quintessential truth or quintessential reality or universal order, whatever it may be, however you want to say it, the monad even, something that is proper, the praxism, if you want to go that far. As long as there is a sight of that, you can sort of transcend the law of analogical correspondences. So even if you were to have a given society, let's say a given human civilization, as long as that human civilization's reference points are in that which is most fundamental, they are not subject to the laws of the Kali Yuga. They exist transcendentally outside of the laws that typify the Kali Yuga. And this is an important distinction to make, I think, because this can be applied both to the individual and to the group itself, or to a given group itself. Evola talks about... Go ahead.
I think we can point to an example, which is one we've touched upon in a previous episode, though we've scrubbed that from our channel, is the Taliban and their retaking of Afghanistan, and the Afghani people themselves being probably a very good example, at least the closest we have, of this exception to the effects of the Kali Yuga, because their central points, their reference points for their society has been stable and constant throughout the entirety of their history and the histories that other civilizations have had interacting with them. And they've been dubbed the graveyard of empires for a reason, and now they persist and have adapted into adopting and utilizing to the best of their abilities these new technologies that have come about. And it seems to have surprised everyone, because there was this negative stereotype, this propagandistic image of these people being backwoods, sort of Luddites, kind of like the
Amish,
return to monkey type people.
Yeah,
that were stuck in the dark ages and wouldn't be able to govern themselves, and then that's the excuses that people were giving to the U.S. military industrial complex. Sorry about that. And why we were occupying them for so long. But now that we've left in, what was it, a year and a half's time, 2 years? Like a year and a half's time it's been so far that we've evacuated from Afghanistan. They're up and running the country like a first world nation, at parable with everything. Utilizing the technologies that we left behind, training people to utilize them, having a much better quality of life than what previously was there. I mean, given they were a war zone for 20 straight years, and even before that, they just, everyone trying to perpetually antagonize these people, and they just are resilient and unaffected by it altogether, and they just keep on striving forward and keep doing their duty to God, doing their duty to their communities and themselves. And I think they are a very, very good example on what to follow and how to approach all of these issues facing us. Because if they can face down the Romans, the British Empire, the USSR, and the Americans in short succession from the USSR, and still come out even better than before, I think that says something a lot about the quality of people that they have there.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That's a good example. I would say that's a pretty good example. The example I was going to give is kind of it goes back to the Ur group, which is what we were talking about before. The members of whom were sort of all of these different spiritualist types. You have people of all different backgrounds in Julius Evola's Ur group. Let's see here. You have, just to name a few, you have Christians, Catholics even. You have Freemasons, Hermeticists, You have followers of Rudolf Steiner, Pythagoreans, anthroposophists, even a psychoanalyst or psychoanalyst. So Evola's Ur group was kind of this idea of identifying the perennial tradition or identifying the perennial principle, the perennial unifying essence of reality or whatever, and actively trying to implement it through their given society. And if you look into it, they do much the same things that that you were talking about, Cody, or at least that was their goal. They tried to let's see, they were very devoted to study. So they had like I said, they had a publication of magazines titled Ur, and what they tried to do was they wanted to give a spiritual authenticity to the fascist movements that were appearing in the 20s, which they criticized for being populistic and nationalistic and materialistic. And they saw within these movements no sort of spiritual basis, but what they saw was a certain quality, and that quality was action. They saw that among the docility and the disparity of all of those around them, philosophers and otherwise, they just came out of the era of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and all of them. What they saw in the face of that with these fascist movements or these third positionist movements or even the conservative revolutionary movements or what have you going on at the time, they saw in them the quality of action, which they did not see in these philosophers going past. And so what they wanted to do was take the opportunity to graft onto this action a character that is of a proper type and sort of graft the properties or the qualities of the heroes of the Iron Age onto these movements. And so I don't know if it was the whole group itself, but there were members of it, Arturo Regini and Amadeo Rocco Armentano, which I might be butchering their names, but essentially they were so Armentano, together with Arturo Regini, was one of the main creators of the pagan revival in Italy. So what they tried to do was they tried to revive the Roman pagan tradition based on these perennial traditional principles. And Evola, for a time, was a little bit he was sympathetic of that, but over time he saw that they themselves became very loyal to this sort of dogma, and the group wound up splitting because so many people tried to take it in so many different directions. But I find that interesting because I think that contributed.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think they find that, or I think that contributed to Evola's spiritual pessimism because he saw in so many people a certain potential, not only in the movements that he tried to graft onto which he tried to graft the traditional principles, but the people with whom he was trying to graft onto these movements the traditional principles. You know what I mean? So he's sort of seeing the sort of lack of sight of all of his contemporaries, and that's why he made the correspondence with Guénon to try to, identify and hash out what was good and what was true. But yeah, I find that very interesting. But another group like that is what we're doing with Praxia, and that's kind of where I wanted to take this point, was that what we're doing with Praxia is trying to identify the perennial idea behind all of tradition, all of reality. Let's see, in the mission statement, I even said this somewhere. I said that so basically what a group would have to do to endure the Kali Yuga and to move forward after the Kali Yuga has collapsed, it would have to, in a sense, I say there must be an identification of and a maintained alignment with the conception of Praxism, which is this idea of the perennial tradition, as a pure and essential principle alone, regardless of any formalized variant or expression which may be applicable to a given context. It must be understood as a principle prior to formalism, prior to interpretation, and prior to expression. The devotion of such institutions and the members thereof to this conception must manifest as a devotion to a universal principle that supersedes all dogmas. And so it must be understood as a universal doctrine of propriety, which once it becomes formalized in any way is limited to such a formalization and stripped of the necessary qualities which require consistent identification. And that's what I think Evola was having a problem with so many members were becoming so attached to the formality of what the Ur group was trying to talk about, especially because they all come from these various backgrounds, and so they have a certain loyalty to the background they come from rather than the group itself. But I think as long as there is an identification of the principle behind the dogma, if there is a loyalty to the universal itself rather than a loyalty to one given tradition or another. That's not to say that you can't identify these things personally as true, but if you were to give your whole your qualitative loyalty to a given thing, it should be that which is most universal, because that will be what, in a sense, counters all of the equally universal in conception materializations that go on in society, or not just society, but in just the world around us in the age we live in. So,
if I may, I can add to that as well.
oh sure,
Is like you were saying, I think that could be utilized as a good thing, and that each of these different directions of dogma that these people had could be utilized in a positive way, where people organizing under these umbrellas must not see the group that they are organizing under, or the facilities that they're organizing under, as some sort of thing to take over and be molded into the direction they want. It is to collectivize and bounce off of people coming from different directions and then going off and doing your own thing, but always circling back to this main hub of organization, so that you don't lose sight of your goals, you don't get disenfranchised or disillusioned, and you have friends in various different places. And that's, I think, a lesson that we can learn from the group, and even more contemporarily from other groups that we've seen come and go today, and what many in our spheres are learning from now, with groups like the basket weavers, or the bears in Pretaria, and so on and so forth. And it'd be even better if we can kind of merge some of these groups together, or at least have outreach there where people are aware of these different communities, these different societies that are all kind of in the same in the same agreement on the principles and the fundamentals and the universals that presuppose the differences we may have going in the directions we want to take things, so that we can support each other in positive ways, and not have, like what I said before, these different solutions that we want to go down canceling each other out. Because if we have communication on what roads each of these individual groups or persons may be going down to try and help us collectively, then we could have that be a positive feedback loop that just keeps gaining momentum, and that's how it'll snowball, and we will win. That's the eventuality of it all. That is one of the reasons why I think it's so prescient that we bring up the pagans so much, because like Vincent was saying, and what he was just mentioning on Evola seeing, is that there is so much potential in these groups, in these people, and it's frustrating to watch them because they're so invested in playing out this LARP that they have by trying to display this pageantry that we've mentioned before, when there are so many more important things that can be gathered and lifted from paganism and applied into modernity, and shift us away from modernity into tradition again. But trying to recreate the past isn't how you do that. And we've beat this dead horse enough already, but we have to kind of hammer that home, that it is finding out what our ancestors did right, and then not trying to do what they did to a T, but knowing the essence of the thing, and then recreating that as the ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that is what we're trying to do with Praxia. All of what you just said is essentially what our goal is to become this sort of hub, this sort of ecumenical hub, if you will, of various traditions who identify with this capital T type of tradition, who want to really learn and participate in this reality and this mode of being, and then graft onto society this mode of being as well. One of the benefits of the removal of the individual from the contemporary sphere or the temporal plane is that the individual, through this removal and through the identification of this perennial wisdom is able to participate in the same type of spirituality that defines the golden age or defines a proper civilization. And then through this, they are able to kind of band together in groups like this and transpose this mode of being onto the individuals. But it comes through a method, not just a brute force. Like you said, it necessitates the fox mindset. It doesn't necessitate the lion mindset, especially in this case where what it requires is, in a sense, a sort of realignment of the civilizational reference points with that which is most fundamental. And to do that, you have to educate people on that. And so I think there's a large path ahead of us in the sphere of academia. I think that like if I were crowned, king god tomorrow, what I would do is I would institute in schools a number of classes, ranging from high school level to college level, most of which would be mandatory, just on philosophy, on Platonism and all of these ideas of being and becoming and trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality. And it's funny because I was listening to a lecture with someone recently about being and becoming and things like that, and they were like, "Well, what's the point of all this?" And I feel like that's a question that many people would ask, many common folk would ask, because they don't necessarily care for it. But the fundamental purpose of it is so that we never lose sight of it. It's so that we never lose sight of that which is most fundamental, so that we have the ground and the basis on which to define God. And because we can define God, we can define all of the other things which sequentially proceed from God, or unfold and become further removed from God, like humanity or physical reality or things like that. We can order things, and we have a consistent reference point in God. God being the most fundamental principle, the pure action, pure being type of thing. And so yeah, if I were crowned, like I said, king of the universe tomorrow, that's what I would do, because that would be that would be step number one in shifting the fundamental reference point of civilization back towards that which is most fundamental. It would be, first of all, an identification and an education about what is most fundamental. That would become that is I think most imperative. So the goal ahead of us is essentially to teach. That is the number one goal, is to teach. That is the first mode of action. And I think Evola realized this when he founded his group, because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to educate people through his magazine, which was shut down at the time, very vehemently by the fascist government and whatnot. He wanted to educate people on tradition. That's why he wrote. And same thing with Guénon. That's why they wrote. Guénon knew that he wasn't writing to a wide array of people. He knew he was writing to those who were most committed. Same thing with Evola. Evola had very few followers himself. He had disciples and whatnot, but he wasn't a widely renowned philosopher in any great. Nothing
not until
like
today.
Yeah, not until today. But even today, he's much more obscure than this. Like Jung or Nietzsche or someone like that.
Oh, of course, yes.
So, but that's the path of action that they took, was education. And I think that in his youth, Evola saw he was very opportunistic, I think, in seeing the revolutions that were going on against the liberal order, which he did not see the character of those who were carrying out those revolutions, because in the beginning he was so focused on the revolutions actually happening in the first place. He was very focused on, oh, look, you have this revolt against the modern world, just like I said in my book. You have this idea of revolt against an order that is entirely profane and orders everything to the material plane and wants to, that focuses on the most profane aspect of society or civilization or even reality, which is that which is temporal. And he says you have a revolt against that. That must mean that the character of this revolt is, of course, holistic and good, and he sees in that an opportunity to take charge and, be sort of an accelerationist in a sense. So that's where his mindset in the 20s was, where after World War II, he became this sort of pessimist. And he said, basically, you have to ride the tiger, as it were. You're basically screwed. You are living in the Kali Yuga, and that is as much as you can say for yourself. You know what I'm saying? And so...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where I disagreed and pointed out that it's not the tiger that we're riding, it's, the snake we're wrestling, and then the hero will come along to defeat the tiger itself.
Exactly.
Or the lion,
Exactly.
whichever you prefer.
Yeah. And I think that, I think because Evola was older, you just have a natural tendency to become set in your ways as you get older. You have a certain nostalgia.
Every old person I talk to, from my grandparents to some of the people I work with, are just so, like, some of them are just grumpy.
Yeah.
But some of them are just so disillusioned to the world as what they grew up with versus what they're seeing now.
Yeah.
And they just say, I'm sorry you have to live in this world. I won't be around much longer, and I'm frightened to see this is the world I'm leaving behind. And I'm thinking to myself, because I don't want to frighten them, but I don't want to leave them pessimistic either, that, well, I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Like that.
These are the cards I was dealt.
Chesterton, yeah, like the Chesterton quote from White Horse was, the tides grow higher, the sky grows darker, push on.
Exactly.
I won't go gentle into that good night.
Exactly. And so it's that pessimistic attitude that people get when they get older. I think that we need to focus on not losing sight of. That we need to focus on not losing sight of the optimistic attitude as we get older, and not grafting onto ourselves this pessimistic attitude, because I think that was in part what Evola had, what characterized Evola's attitude as time went on. So he was getting older in the 60s and the 70s. He was well into his 60s and 70s, I think. So he definitely had a nostalgia for when he was in his youth, in the 20s and in the 30s. So
we have to preserve our virile and vitality.
Exactly. Exactly. So he definitely had a sort of nostalgia that was playing at him and sort of being this tugging weight against his optimism moving forward. And I think as time progressed, he had this pessimistic attitude. But the quality of the civilization itself that we see today versus the quality of the civilization that he lived in is not too far different. It's not too far gone, I don't think. At least it's not too far gone in the sense that it is not on the same trajectory that it was on before. It's still on the same trajectory. We're just further down that trajectory. But I don't think Evola realized how bad it was going to get in his lifetime even, and how fast things were going to accelerate before this, before the Kali Yuga came to an end. And I think that that's what we have to keep in mind ourselves, because we are very young, and I'm pretty sure that everybody watching this video is probably going to be from 18 to 40. That's maybe 45. Like, I don't think it's going to be 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds.
I'd say younger than that, because think about where we started with this. We were 15, 16 ourselves, and though this might be a bit advanced for people that age, especially thinking back to how we were when we were 15 or 16, I still think it would have a certain attractiveness to at least hear different ideas.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially from people much closer to their age, because we're in our early 20s. We were 15, 16 not that long ago. We were still in high school and college and whatnot. And even some of the people I talk to in real life and, interact with on a daily or weekly basis, some of them are that young. And I see that interest in their eyes and in all these different things. I was even being asked about, what this podcast is by someone just that young, because they were interested in learning more about it. And you always have to be careful in how you approach that, because you don't want to just dump all of this information on a person who's unprepared for it, because it might just scare them away entirely.
There's no way to begin. There's no beginning point either.
Yeah. But if they have that genuine pursuit of interest, that gleam in their eyes, then walk them down that road. Help them. Be a bit of a mentor to them. Because if you had someone like that when you were that young, imagine how much further advanced you would be yourselves. You want to always see someone outshine you.
Exactly. But I think that because the audience of this video is going to be during that in that age range, which is the same age range that Evola was in when he was still in his optimistic phase, we in a sense are living in the same type of civilization that he was living in at his age. The same characteristics are all around us. We have these culminations of these various forces right now that's going on, especially in the 20s. I feel like this will be a very I feel like the 2020s will be very reminiscent, in essence, of like things like the phrase from the 1960s, where like if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. I think it'll be like that. If you remember the 2020s, you weren't there. But
Yeah.
I feel like the because we live in these times, the same times or this with the same qualities that characterize the times that Evo lived in his 20s and 30s, and because he had such an optimistic attitude back then, and because his optimistic attitude almost came to fruition, if Mussolini had been a little bit more receptive of his ideas, and maybe if things had went a different way, these were the times he was living in. We can look at it with a historic lens, but these were what he saw in real time. And so we can do that same thing here, and we can be optimistic about it and say, we are seeing we see ourselves, this light behind the veil, as it were, this perennial wisdom behind the obstruction that the Kali Yuga places, but between us and that perennial wisdom, we have reached through and grabbed onto something that is very stable and fundamental, and because of that, we can remain optimistic that we will never lose sight of this. We will never lose sight of this idea, this wisdom, this gnosis, as it were, and because of that, we have the foundations of something that can last as long as need be to get us out of the Kali Yuga. That's pretty much all I had planned for today's episode. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, I was thinking about how to close this off, and I'm honestly lost for words, because I think just this is one of the episodes where we're just all laid out on the table, and there's not really a definitive solution other than the ones that we may have laid out, is reiterating the communication between these various dissident groups, the neo-pagans, the primitivists, the traditionalists, the Catholics, the what's another one, perennialists, and so on and so forth, going down the line of these different spheres. We can all work together. We just have to know our strengths and our focuses, and accept each other as friends, and the friend-enemy distinction type of deal. But even more than just the Machiavellian sort of assessment of everyone, to be friendly with each other and support each other going down these various avenues, these focuses that each of us have, these specialties, these niches that we can be most effective in eroding the common enemy we all have, so that we can bring our more ideal world into fruition. And we'll never be able to do that by infighting with each other like we are. It's more or less effective having the backing to all of the means of attack that the systems that be, that the people in power utilize, would be used against us, like the financial systems, or the I can't really name any others, that they're very subtle and implicit, but all of these different types of means of censorship, or
academia, the
ruining
media,
people's
all
lives,
of
the academia, the media, things like that. And it's more or less a defending each other on those fronts, and then letting us go out into the world and doing what each of us do best, each of these groups do best. And that way we're centralized in a way, but we're decentralized in where we're attacking the cathedral, and it won't be at its strongest points like academia or the media. None of that directly, because that's the throwing the rock at the tank again. It's reorganizing, protecting ourselves from the means of attack that have been demonstrated time and again, even with people as wealthy and famous and you would think influential and powerful, like Kanye West, a former billionaire, only former because he attacked the system at its strongest, or at one of its strongest points, and they used the financial levers at their control to no longer make him a billionaire. And that's something that we have to recognize, prepare for, and be able to support any of our compatriots in the actualization of these plans, because that will be such a enormous morale boost. And people are doing that in Bertaria, the Old Glory Club, I think there was something with the there's like an economists group that was doing something similar with like Murray Rothbard and academic agent, and they were all kind of doing that same thing. But it's this sort of collectivization we have, and then people like us focusing on the spiritual optimism that we have here, and then others doing their own things that will all sort of start to make a much bigger impact. I think that's the best we can say to summarize and close on today's episode.
Absolutely. So this has been the case for spiritual optimism in response to the modern Platonist video of the spiritual pessimism of Julius Evola. I hope everybody's enjoyed. I thank you all for listening into today's podcast. If you're interested in finding out more about us, you can check the links in the description down below. We have all of our socials down there. Our new Substack will be down there, and the modern Platonist video itself will be down there for reference for anyone who would like to go and watch. I would definitely recommend it. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and I hope to see you back here next time at the Praxist Table Talks.